Tory Philip Hammond refused to deny saying public sector workers are overpaid after being confronted with a struggling cleaner's payslip on live TV. Labour's John McDonnell slammed the Chancellor for the comments, allegedly made during a cabinet meeting last week. He told the BBC's Andrew Marr, "I was at Bart's Hospital yesterday with the cleaners, who are on strike." Why are they on strike? Because they asked for 30p an hour extra and were refused it. "One of the cleaners gave me a payslip," he said, brandishing the document from an inside jacket pocket. This woman, full-time worker, earns £297 a week. At the moment, median rent in London is nearly £1,500 a month. To buy a house in London is £500,000. Ask Philip Hammond if he can live on that. Asked whether the reports of his having made the comments were accurate, Mr. Hammond refused to answer, saying discussions at cabinet meetings were private. But he did deny another report that he said even women could drive trains now. At the same meeting, 5 anonymous cabinet ministers made the claim to the Sunday Times that Hammond had made the comments. But asked on the same Andrew Marr show whether he said it, Hammond said, "Andrew, I'm not going to go into what was or wasn't said in a cabinet meeting, and it's easy to quote a phrase out of context." But he went on to suggest public sector workers were getting a better pay deal than their private sector counterparts. He said, public sector pay raced ahead of private sector pay after the crash in 2008, and taking public sector pay before pension contributions, that gap has now closed. Public and private sector pay are now on average around about the same level, but when you take into account the very generous contributions that public sector employers have to pay in for their workers' very generous pensions, they are still about 10% ahead. He admitted some areas of the public sector were struggling to hire and keep staff because of low wages, and that some areas of the country had a wider gap between public and private sector pay. Asked directly if he thought the public sector were overpaid, he said it was a relative question about the difference between the public and private sector. He added, relative to private sector workers, they are paid about a 10% premium. Presented with the cleaner's payslip, and asked if he thought she was overpaid, he said, "No, of course she's not overpaid. But look, John McDonnell needs to remember that it was a Conservative government who introduced the national living wage. The so-called national living wage, introduced by Hammond's George Osborne, is not the same as the living wage, calculated by the Resolution Foundation as the lowest level of pay to live comfortably. The national living wage, essentially a rebranded minimum wage for the over 25s, is currently £7.50 an hour, almost £1 an hour lower than the actual living wage.